So there's this famous story about a blind man, or a group of blind men, who come across an elephant. And they don't know what sort of being an elephant is. So they decide to reach out and touch the elephant to discern this. The first one reaches out, and he touches the trunk of the elephant, and he says the elephant is like a thick snake. The second blind man reaches out, and he touches the side of the elephant, and he says how smooth the elephant is like a wall. The third blind man reaches out, and he grabs the tusk, how sharp the elephant is like a spear. The fourth blind man touches the one leg, how tall the elephant is like a tree. The fifth blind man reaches out, and he touches the ear of the elephant, how wide an elephant is like a fan. The sixth blind man reaches out, and he touches the tail. The elephant is thin like rope. And from here, the story has various endings, but they all circle around the same basic theme. An argument ensues, it gets rowdy, the men are about ready to come to blows, and in the most common ending to the story, this noise wakes up the Raja, this Indian king, who from his balcony calls out, "The elephant is a big animal, and each man is only touching one part, and you must put all the parts together to discern what the elephant is like." I hate this story. It's really terrible. See, the moral of the story is supposed to be something like this. We all have different experiences. Therefore, whenever we find ourselves at odds with others, we should be humble and recognize the limitation of our knowledge, our need for other perspectives, and trust that others may grasp truths that we do not. But this story backfires in a number of ways. First, it assumes a knowledge of truth that the story asserts is unknowable. For how can you know that the blind men only see part of the elephant unless you can see the whole elephant? Second, the story itself undercuts the idea that we should be satisfied with our partial piece of the truth pie by revealing the full truth at the end of the story. It also undercuts the idea that we should look for the truth in the perspective of someone else because each of the men was wrong about what an elephant was. Rather, the story should drive us to seek the truth, and in that we can and should rely on the perspectives of others, but only so that we can argue towards the truth together. The point of the story is that in their darkness, the men were not seeing the elephant truly. There is a reality, and it is incumbent upon us to see it accurately. Finally, the story undercuts its own idea of blindness by opening the door for revelation at the end. In order to see the truth, the blind men needed revelation, which came from the Raja. Today's gospel reading is about a blind man, but it's important to take a moment to go over how we got here. See, this summer, we've been reading through much of Mark and a little of John, and Mark's gospel is the most condensed of all of the gospels. It's exhausting, right? Jesus is here, and he did this, and then he goes here, and he did this, and then he goes here, and he did this, and he goes here, and he did this, and then he died. And within this, you have sort of three acts. You have the ministry in Galilee, the road to Jerusalem, then the ministry in Jerusalem. And throughout these three acts, Mark, the evangelist, is giving us stories, events in the life of Jesus that reveal who he is, and then the people's responses to these events. Within his ministry in Galilee, he's announced as the new king. His kingdom is announced. He begins establishing a new order, and he's promptly rejected by the political leaders, by the religious leaders, by his own town, and even the disciples don't get it. At the end of his ministry in Galilee, the disciples are sitting around and they're grumbling because they're hungry and they have no bread. And you can almost hear the exasperation in Jesus' voice as he says to them, "How many baskets of bread were left over when I fed 5,000 people with 5 loaves?" 12, Jesus. "And when I fed 4,000 with 7 loaves, how many baskets were left over then?" 7, Jesus. All right, so what part of this are you not getting? How can you not see it? And this concludes Act 1. What a depressing end to the first act, right? Well, right on cue, Mark opens Act 2 with great irony. There's Jesus with these disciples who don't see who he is, and a man who is literally blind is brought to him. Note, this is not our blind man. And Jesus lays hands on him, and Mark tells us he opened his eyes, his sight was restored, and he saw clearly. So they move on, and on their way to the next town, he asks, "Who do people say that I am?" Some say Elijah, others say one of the prophets. Okay, well, who do you say I am? And here's Peter. "You are the Christ." Yes, they're getting it. So Jesus begins telling them what's going to happen, how he's going to be rejected, how he's going to be killed, how he will rise again on the 3rd day. And here comes Peter, right on cue, and he rebukes Jesus. Can you imagine? This guy who literally just said, "You are the Christ," has the gall, the chutzpah, to look at Jesus and tell him he's wrong. Remember our blind men in the beginning? The elephant is like a thick snake. So he takes Peter, James, and John up a mountain, and he's transfigured in dazzling white, and Moses and Elijah appear, and right on cue again comes Peter. "Rabbi, it's good that we were here. Let us build 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah." And it's at this point that Mark gives us some great color commentary. He says, Peter said this because they didn't know what to say, and they were terrified. As an aside, do you know people like this? People who will say the dumbest things at the worst possible moment? So this big cloud forms and envelops them. And out of this thick cloud, a voice bellows, "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him." And after this, as they're hiking down the mountain, Jesus tells them, instructs them, "Don't tell anybody what you just saw until after I'm raised from the dead." So what do? They question among themselves what Jesus meant by raised from the dead. The elephant is smooth and big like a wall. When they get down the mountain, they find the rest of the disciples in a large crowd, and a rowdy argument has broken out. It seems a man has brought his demon-possessed son to be healed, and the disciples can't do it. So Jesus, frustrated that they still aren't getting this, heals the boy. And then as they're moving on down the road, he tells them for a second time that he's going to be killed, but he will rise again in 3 days. And Mark gives us some more of his color commentary. They still don't understand, and at this point they're too afraid to ask. I guess no one wanted to be called Satan again. So instead, they decide to have an argument amongst themselves over which one of them is the greatest. Like how sharp the elephant is. The elephant is like a sharp spear. So Jesus and his disciples continue on their way to Jerusalem. And along the way, Jesus is teaching. And we don't have time to go through it all. So we'll skip ahead to where Jesus foretells of his death for a third time. What's the reaction this time? There's no rebuking, there's no confusion, there's no disbelief. No, instead, James and John, who remember were at the transfiguration, come to him and they say, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask you to do." And he replies, "What do you want me to do for you?" And they tell him how they want to sit at his right hand and his left hand in his glory. That is, when his kingdom comes into its fulfillment. Jesus is like, hey, things are fixing to get really ugly. I'm going to be arrested. I'm going to be mocked. I'm going to be spit on. I'm going to be flogged. I'm going to be tortured. And then I will be executed. And James and John are like, cool. Hey, by the way, can we be your number two? How tall an elephant is, like a tree. And this finally brings us to today's gospel. This is the end of Act 2, and Jesus and his disciples are in Jericho. Remember, Jericho was an impregnable city. The Israelites marched around it once a day for 6 days, and on the seventh day they marched around 7 times, blew their trumpets, and the walls came tumbling down. They took the city so decisively that the only survivors were a prostitute named Rahab and her family. And they were only spared because she helped the Israelite spies when they came to spy on the city. And the Gospel of Matthew tells us that she is the mother of Boaz, and Boaz is the father of Obed, and Obed is the father of Jesse, and Jesse is the father of David the king. So they are literally standing in a city that is a testament to God's character and to his faithfulness. And all the while the disciples have eyes and they don't see. But here is this blind beggar sitting on the side of the road, and he hears the commotion. And he learns that this commotion coming through town is Jesus. And he begins to cry out, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And the people around him rebuke him, and they tell him to shut up. But that only makes him cry out more, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Because in the ultimate irony, it's the blind man who sees who Jesus really is. Jesus, hearing the commotion, orders that the blind man's brought to him. And is hearing this, the blind man throws off his coat and he runs to Jesus. Can you imagine this, right? He's blind, can't see, so there's probably stumbling involved and knocking things over and tripping, but nothing will get him to keep him from getting to him who he knows is his salvation, because he knows who he really is. And you can almost see Jesus' sideways glance at James and John as he says the very same words he said to them. "What do you want me to do for you?" And the beggar replies, "To see." And Jesus says to him, "Go your way, your faith has made you well." And immediately his sight is restored. So there's this elephant. And a group of blind men come to him. And they're trying to discern what he is. One says, "He's like a thick snake." Another, he's big and smooth like a wall. And still another, no, he's sharp like a spear. But the thing is about this elephant in the room is that he speaks. And he's telling us who he is. Are you listening?